Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. In 79, deep beneath Rome's loudest arena, a 19-year-old Dacian girl named Sabina stood shackled in complete darkness. Above her, more than 50,000 Romans roared in celebration, cheering the gladiator who had just slaughtered her brothers in the sand. What happened to Sabina over the next 3 hours would become one of Rome's most aggressively buried secrets, a ritual so vicious that even Roman historians hesitated to record it, a reward so disturbing that the Senate later debated whether it should ever have existed at all. This is the story Roman officials tried to erase, the privilege granted to victors, a privilege that turned a champion into a man who could do almost anything once the gates closed. Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where history is stripped of its lies before we descend into those underground corridors. Hit like if you've ever wondered what really happened after the crowd went home. Subscribe, because once you hear this, you'll never see ancient Rome the same way again. And comment below, did Roman entertainment cross the line? Or was this simply the cost of empire? What you're about to hear is drawn directly from Cassius Dio, supported by Senate records preserved in the Vatican archives, and reinforced by 2018 excavations beneath the Colosseum itself. This is not myth. This was Rome's reality. The Colosseum wasn't just a building. It was a monument to domination. Completed only a year earlier, its massive stone shell could swallow entire armies. The air inside was thick with metal, sweat, incense, and animal rot. The sand beneath the fighters' feet wasn't decorative. It existed to absorb blood. Beneath that sand stretched the hypogeum, a labyrinth of cages and tunnels holding Rome's most valuable resources: the condemned, the captured, and the conquered. Gladiator games were never just entertainment. They were political theater, religious ritual, and psychological warfare fused into spectacle. In 78 AD, General Marcus Antonius crushed a Dacian uprising and returned to Rome with spoils, and 847 captives, including 124 noble women. These were not peasants. They were daughters of chieftains, warrior brides, priestesses. Rome didn't just want victory. It wanted humiliation so absolute that rebellion would never rise again. That afternoon the victor stood waiting. Gaius Valerius Maximus, 32 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, enormous by Roman standards. His body was a map of violence, every scar a survival story. Born a slave, forged by 14 years of bloodshed, he had killed 89 men in official combat. His dream was simple: earn the rudes, the wooden sword of freedom. His fear was worse: dying anonymously, dragged away with hooks. On that August day, he defeated the Dacian champion before Emperor Titus himself. His reward followed tradition: gold, wine, public honor, and first selection among the female captives. Sabina stood among 17 other women in a holding cell. Her village had burned. Her fiancé had been executed 3 months earlier. She wanted only dignity, or death. What she feared most was becoming entertainment for the same crowd that had cheered her people's destruction. That morning, a guard told her she had been selected. She didn't yet understand what that meant. Rome's mercy, she was about to learn, was far more terrifying than its cruelty. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated domination. Rome believed true conquest meant breaking a people's symbols, proving that even their most protected members now belonged to the empire. At precisely 3 p.m., as shadows stretched across the blood-soaked arena, the master of games descended into the hypogeum. Damp stone, panic, silence broken only by chains. He approached Valerius Maximus with a bronze tablet. By imperial tradition, the official recited, "You may choose your reward: gold, wine, rest, or victoria carnalis, the carnal privilege." For a man who owned nothing and could be killed tomorrow, this was power, rare and intoxicating. And Roman society didn't merely allow it, it celebrated it. While the victor decided, preparation began elsewhere. Guards entered the women's chamber carrying buckets of water, not to drink, but to wash. Torn garments were replaced with plain tunics. Hair was combed. Bodies were inspected and marked. An elderly priestess whispered the truth Sabina already feared. "They are deciding whether we die or whether we are used first." Above them, the arena filled once more. Between gladiator bouts, Rome staged interludes, mock hunts, executions, and so-called mythological reenactments, where condemned prisoners reenacted legends that ended in real death. But this performance had a twist. 20 Dacian women were lifted through the arena's elevators, erupting into sunlight as the crowd roared. Sabina felt the heat, smelled roasted meat, perfume, and beneath it all, old blood baking into the sand. What should have been a simple execution became something worse. The women were lined up as a herald announced their crimes: rebellion, defying Roman gods, resisting empire. Then came the humiliation. They were forced to fight each other in pairs, given wooden swords, dressed in shredded costumes meant to mock their defeat. And this was only the beginning, because what followed would stain Rome so deeply that senators would later argue whether it should ever be spoken of again. The winners would be claimed by Rome's champions, the losers would die. If this level of calculated cruelty shocks you, tap that like button, because what comes next shows how this wasn't chaos, it was policy. The breaking point. Wooden swords were handed out. Sabina gripped hers, the rough wood scraping her palm. Across from her stood Chamassicus, Delos' sister, the woman who once taught Livia to weave and sang at her engagement ceremony. Their eyes locked. The crowd screamed for blood. The master of games raised his hand, dropped it. Neither woman moved. The roar shifted, excitement turned to confusion, then rage. "Fight!" the crowd yelled. Cowards, barbarians, trash began to rain down, olive pits, food scraps, whatever spectators had in reach. Still the women didn't lift their swords. It was the only resistance left to them: refusal. For 90 full seconds, the greatest empire on earth was publicly defied by 2 unarmed women standing still. Then the guards stormed in. The stage drama dissolved into real violence. Chamassicus was struck from behind with the flat of a sword, collapsing to the sand. The crowd cheered. Sabina screamed and rushed toward her, letting the wooden sword drop. Both were dragged away, not to execution, but to something the audience found just as entertaining. The real horror begins in the hypogem below. The bureaucratic engine of Roman exploitation kept moving without hesitation. A scry. B entered a note into the record. 20 female captives Dean origin processed for post-victory allocation. Next line. 2 resistant transferred to private chambers for champion exclusive use. What came next became Rome's most polished system of dehumanization. Human beings reduced to inventory. Sabina and Chamassicus were separated, each taken to different rooms. Small stone chambers with benches, iron rings embedded into the walls, and doors locking only from the outside. They were clean, organized, and terrifying precisely because everything was planned. This wasn't improvised cruelty. These rooms were part of the arena's design, just as intentional as the lion cages or gladiator lifts. At 4, Gaius Valerius Maximus entered Sabina's chamber. The door opened, their eyes met. He was still in full arena gear. Someone else's blood stray across his chest. She was cornered against the far wall, drained, unarmed. Between them stood the full weight of Roman law. He had complete legal power, she had none. She was classified as spoils reward earned through killing. History doesn't tell us what Gaius thought. Did he see a person? Did he see property? Did he question the system that turned him into both weapon and prisoner? All we know comes from a clerk's routine report, not from either of them. Then the unimaginable happened. An act of rebellion. Gaius took off his helmet, set his sword aside, and sat down with his head in his hands. For 5 long minutes he said nothing. Sabina remained frozen, bracing for violence that never came. Finally, he spoke in broken Dian, a language he had picked up from other captives. "What was his name?" he asked. "Mine," she replied. "No, the man they made you watch die." "Disabilis." "No, the one from today." She shook her head. He sighed. "I killed a Delos today. Could be family. Your people use that name often." What followed wasn't the assault Rome expected. It was a conversation between 2 people. The empire tried to strip of every shred of humanity. Gaius told her about his father, executed when he was 9. Sabina explained how her home was burned. 2 hours passed. Guards checked twice, heard voices, assumed compliance, and walked on. At 6 p.m., Gaius Valerius Maximus made the decision Rome would never forgive him for. He stood, walked to the chamber door, and called for the guard. "This woman is ill," he declared. "Infected. I refuse the allocation, send her to the physician." It was the only loophole the arena system allowed. If a captive was labeled diseased, a gladiator could legally reject her and return her to general prisoner status. The lie was obvious. The guard recognized it instantly, but Roman bureaucracy ran on rigid procedure. Challenging a gladiator's choice meant paperwork, witnesses, and an inquiry. Accepting the rejection took seconds, and so Sabina was removed, taken to the medical holding section, her immediate fate. She still died 3 days later from a simple infection, the most common killer inside Roman captivity. The medical unit was overcrowded, filthy, and apathetic. The mercy that spared her from one horror delivered her directly into another. Gas never saw her again. He fought twice more that month. He won both bouts and he refused his rewards both times. The empire froze. Whispers spread through the gladiator barracks. Maximus had gone soft. Maximus had joined one of those strange Eastern cults preaching compassion. Maximus had been cursed by Dean witches. But the truth was simpler. He'd remembered what it meant to be human. Brahm's point of no return. On September 15, 79 AD, Senator Quintus Aurelius Symmachus stood before the Senate with an official complaint. His young nephew, a junior gladiator, had been beaten by his trainer for refusing the customary reward after victory. The nephew claimed Maximus's example had inspired him. The trainer insisted he was simply enforcing proper Roman values. It was a trivial case, barely worth discussion, except for one thing. It forced Rome's most powerful men to publicly acknowledge a practice everyone knew existed, but no one ever spoke about. Senate records, the sanitized versions that survived, mention a debate about the appropriateness of certain customs regarding defeated female captives. That mild phrase concealed a 4-hour political brawl about whether Rome had finally crossed a line even its own senators couldn't ignore. The conservative bloc led by Senator Fabius invoked tradition. Our ancestors conquered holy body and spirit. Disforg. Ed our greatness. The reformist faction stoic influenced more pragmatic countered. We are creating martyrs. We are sowing rebellion. Dead rebels are gone, but traumatized survivors carry memories that fuel uprisings for generations. But the true trigger wasn't morality. It was political survival. 3 provincial governors had recently reported spikes in revolt, each referencing Rome's treatment of captive women as propaganda for resistance movements. These governors warned that Rome wasn't intimidating its enemies anymore. It was radicalizing them. The empire was harming itself. The law that shocked Rome. On October 1st, 79 AD, the Senate passed what historians later labeled the Lex Captivity, the law of captive women. Its terms were limited but unprecedented. Female prisoners of war could not be distributed as public rewards in the arena. Public humiliation of conquered women was banned in official spectacles. Private exploitation still occurred, but the theatrical showcase of it was outlawed. Enforcement was unreliable. Many arena managers ignored it or created loopholes, but the principle stood. Even Rome had public limits. Ironically, the law did nothing to free anyone. It only removed the audience. 3 months later, Gaius Valerius Maximus finally earned freedom, not for kindness, but for winning 5 more consecutive bouts. His last recorded act as a free man was purchasing the freedom of a Dean woman named Camascus. The archives identify only her name. Historians Strawn. Glai suspect she was the same woman who stood beside Sabina on the arena floor. Imagine Gaius realizing that his single act of defiance saved one woman for a handful of days. Nothing more. It changed nothing for the thousands who came before the thousands who would come after. The machine was too big, too profitable, too embedded in Roman culture. His rebellion was a raindrop falling into an ocean of blood. Imagine Sabina's final hours dying from a preventable infection, surrounded by other prisoners the empire didn't even bother to document. Not one senator debated her death. Not one historian mentioned her name. In Rome's moral calculus, her suffering wasn't noteworthy enough to register. The tragedy isn't merely that Rome was cruel. Cruelty defined ancient warfare. The true tragedy is that Rome industrialized it, turned it into entertainment, standardized it with paperwork, supply lines, and architectural planning. A system so complete that people disappeared into it without leaving a trace except scratches on stone. In 2018, archaeologists from the University of Rome, led by Dr. Isabella Fortunato, excavated a forgotten section of the Eastern Hypergym. What they found never appeared on tourist brochures: a cluster of small chambers with iron restraints built directly into walls, Drainage channels cut into stone floors, scratch marks carved by desperate hands, pottery fragments used to transport water or food remnants of bedding materials compressed by years of weight. Carbon. Dating confirmed the rooms were from the original 80% construction, meaning they were built intentionally, not added later. 6 bronze tags were recovered stamped with the word captiva and dates spanning 7,982 AD, the exact years of the Diyan suppression. These findings matched textual evidence. Cassius Dio's later writings described allocation chambers for conquered women. Seneca's earlier letters alluded vaguely to the practice without detail. Tacitus, normally graphic, was conspicuously silent, implying even he found it too repulsive to record plainly. Historians debate frequency. Some argue it was rare, reserved for major triumphs. Others point to the specialized construction, abundant evidence, and multiple sources arguing it was routine. The truth lies somewhere in between, not constant, but common enough to design infrastructure for. Romans treated gladiators like ancient celebrities, but with a dark twist. Elite women bribed guards to meet them. Engraved lamps and wall paintings show gladiators posing naked with weapons. Their sweat and blood were sold as aphrodisiacs. Some women even drank it as a fertility cure. The same society that worshipped these men also fed them into machines of death and rewarded them with human beings. Historical accounts describe nocturnal entertainments after major games where wealthy patrons mingled with gladiators and slaves. Women captured in war were paraded as trophies, sometimes forced to reenact myths involving gods like Jupiter or Mars. Before being used as gifts, prisoners forced to strip during triumphal parades, victims tied to stakes to imitate myths before execution, enemy queens paraded publicly before being handed to generals. None of it was accidental, it was a message to the world. Rome owns your past, present, and future. Gladiator games weren't random, they were part of the muna, obligations owed to the public. Patrons who hosted games had incentives to increase spectacle. Humiliation of captives became a selling point. The 19th century historian Theodore Emerson called this Rome's most efficient machine of dehumanization. What he meant was simple. Rome didn't just conquer bodies, it conquered identity, memory, and meaning. The fact that we still debate these events today shows how deep the scars run. The 2000 film Gladiator barely whispered about this reality, hinting at it only in shadows. And modern scholars still argue whether discussing these practices exposes Roman brutality responsibly, or simply risks sensationalizing it. But it matters because it shows exactly how a civilization can defend cruelty through laws, customs, and entertainment. Rome wasn't the only empire capable of horrifying acts, but it perfected the ability to normalize them, to turn violence into ritual and transform screams into crowd-pleasing spectacle. The deeper truth is this. The line separating civilization from barbarism has never been measured by marble temples, paved roads, or towering arches, but by how a society treats those with no power at all. Rome engineered aqueducts that survived 2,000 years, yet at the same time built chambers beneath its stadiums where human beings were violated as casually as props in a performance. Its brilliance and its moral emptiness existed side by side without contradiction. It also reveals how power distorts everyone it touches. Gas was both victim and tool, enslaved, controlled, forced to kill for survival, yet granted authority over someone even more helpless than him. The system twisted ordinary people into instruments of cruelty and turned human suffering into entertainment when it should have stirred empathy instead of applause. It warns us about the danger of using tradition as moral justification. Our ancestors did. It became Rome's answer to every ethical question, until habit replaced humanity and atrocity became routine. And it raises questions we still struggle with today. What other buried horrors lie beneath the monuments we admire? How many tourist attractions sit on layers of forgotten misery? When does confronting the past become necessary? And when does it cross into exploitation? Think of Sabina's final moments, dying of infection in a cramped cell beneath the grandest structure of her time. Did she wonder if anyone would remember her? Did she imagine that 2,000 years later, archaeologists might find her tag and speak her name aloud again? History's darkest stories remind us that progress isn't guaranteed, that civilizations fall moral. Why, long before they fall physically, and that every generation must choose between empathy or efficiency. Rome chose spectacle. The cost was measured in lives erased, but the lesson survives in the ruins beneath the arena floor. And so, A gladiator's victory became permission for cruelty. A routine reward became one of Rome's most carefully buried scandals. Hundreds of diya captives disappeared into bureaucratic lists, and one young woman named Sabina survived only because a single fighter made an unusual choice. A choice that changed nothing except proving humanity could still flicker even in Rome's darkest machinery. If this story unsettled you, subscribe because uncomfortable truths matter far more than comforting myths. Tell us in the comments what disturbed you most, the calculated nature of the exploitation or Rome's efficiency at making it routine.